as a collaborative, oh, thank you. Now we're being recorded. As a collaborative planning process to fill our niches of food infrastructure with some sort of more increased or targeted planning effort as to what kind of facility we might put in Montgomery County and or the region to meet our needs for food infrastructure. And to give you a little background of where are we, just, food hub, just in case folks wanted to kind of get their heads around what we're talking about. For about a decade, or more, folks have been talking a lot about food hubs and the need for food hubs. And what is a food hub? If for those of us who've never perhaps seen one or heard of one, it's a facility that's sort of like a warehouse that facilitates the aggregation, storage, processing, and distribution of food. In particular, that's nothing new, but why we talk about it is because we need to build out our food aggregation, storage, processing, distribution to cater to our local food system. So this is, aggregating small quantities of farm products from local farms instead of large facilities with large farms out west. So folks have been talking about this for about a decade. So in 2016, the Montgomery County Food Council contracted Cultivate Ventures, a consultant, and they conducted a feasibility study on food hubs. And the grand conclusion of that in 2016 was that for now, let's focus on building our production capacity. So that was met with a programming response. A number of programming and policies did come out of that. We moved on from there. And then, of course, now we're here in pandemic times, right? Or the pandemic times hit, and now we're in this post-pandemic sort of realm where the pandemic sort of highlighted the need for a greater investment in food assistance. The Farm to Food Bank program was born. Our Farm to Food Bank capacity building grant, which basically gave farmers assistance to increase the capacity for their food production, has now hit a point where where the farms are would like to sell to the food bank, and we have the capacity now. Also, the pandemic times obviously highlighted a lot of food supply chain shortages, and needless to say, that was making the kind of climate awareness was happening as climate change became more and more undeniable, and now we're having focus on increasing food resilience. So that's sort of against a backdrop of, why food hubs, why now, right? So as part of our initiative, we've been talking about, okay, well, what sort of infrastructure is here in Montgomery County and the region that can assist with the sort of, aggregation, distribution, storage, and getting food to people, right, in our local food system. So as one of our first tours along the route, we recently toured Crossroads Community Kitchen. It's a shared kitchen space. It helps small businesses get started because you pay by the hour to use the shared kitchen space for commercial kitchens. And just, I wanted to provide a few quick highlights because I know for those of us who weren't on the tour, just what were some of the big takeaways. So, and as you can see, I don't know if you can see, Ivy Baker IV is here in the Hawaiian shirt down here on the lower left, showing off I believe those are empanadas being stored. And he is sort of the mastermind of the shared kitchen. And I feel like this kitchen is possible because of him. And this kitchen uses software expertly to coordinate the kitchen. They use a schedule to sort of, it's like an extremely delicate dance that each of them have to use the kitchen. Sometimes the businesses are using the kitchen at the same time, and Ivy plans that out very carefully. Also, they offer valuable business assistance services for new food businesses. So we're talking like website design, making sure they understand business structures, making sure they understand marketing, and overall making sure they have legal compliance, kind of they're understanding their legal compliance responsibilities. And one of the big takeaways from our tour of Crossroads Community Kitchen was that they are talking about streamlining sourcing for local raw ingredients. We also toured 4P Foods. It is a food hub led by Tom McDougall. And they started out with just one cooler in a small warehouse in Culpeper. He told us that he actually put his condo up as collateral for an Eagle Bank loan to, it was like something in the order of, and he said it was an open book, so I don't think he'd mind me sharing that. He said it was in the order of something right under $200,000 to fund the business at the startup. But now they've grown, and that was, I think 5 or 6 years ago. I apologize, I can't remember the exact timeline, but now they source from 600 to 1,100 farmers, and they source from farmers that are down to a quarter acre all the way up to 4,000 acres. They source they source from other places to fill CSA boxes with a full grocery list, because one of their primary markets are CSA customers. They also work with other food hubs to fill their CSA boxes, and are very involved in the Eastern Food Hub Collaborative. So they basically have a network of places they buy from, but the bulk of it is from local farmers. So they sell CSA boxes for customers. They also sell institutional sales involving the public schools and a few other institutions. And they have a food bank, and they basically have deliveries to the food bank, and they're involved in the Foodies Medicine program. And one of the big takeaways from this tour was that, we always talk about our distribution system as sort of a spoken wheel structure, right? There's the middle, and then it fans out to all these different places, like the spokes of a wheel. But if we can decentralize that into many spokes, many wheels, then Tom has this vision that I really loved, that many of us sort of latched onto, which was, if we can't do economies of scale, we can do economies of collaboration. So he's really interested in working with others to also develop methods for regenerative capital, and he has a lot of interesting financing schemes that they are now employing that were very illuminating to learn about. And he also says that part of the regenerative capital is perhaps also termed patient capital, because you have to consider that you might have a 20-year investment before you have any return. We also recently toured Sandy Springs Farm, and I see that Laura Charcudian is on the call, and I wanted to call her out because we toured the farm. And yes, that is Laura Charcudian on the top of the ladder in a historic barn looking at the garlic racks. So thank you. And thank you for Tom Farquhar at Sandy Spring Farms for touring us around his farm. And this is sort of just one side of the issue that we've been learning about recently, because Montgomery County Public Schools is very interested in purchasing from local farmers. However, they source from Lancaster Foods, which is a large distributor in Jessup, and that Lancaster Foods requires GAP certification, like many of them do. There are 0 farms currently GAP certified in Montgomery County. So that GAP certification is something that we're working on. Tom Farquhar is very close to getting GAP certified, and we're seeing if that's one side of the issue. We also discussed at Sandy Springs Farm, very importantly, the scale of equipment needed at the aggregation facility, because our food system is so large and centralized that we have very few equipment options available that are small enough that can operate at the scale that we would need in Montgomery County. So we hope to explore future food hubs and or models. We hope to explore, and we've been talking to Dreaming Out Loud in DC. And I know one of the big takeaways there was that they have good connections for their institutional sales, and that Chris at Dreaming Out Loud, who runs Dreaming Out Loud, he said that we need to think about personnel first, which is very important. I know that we're talking with Frederick Fresh Online in Urbana. They have a very interesting model for a small food hub and mostly online. It's a lot of volunteers staffing. So that's like one example of a small food hub. And for our regional collaboration possibilities for structures that might help us collaborate. In addition to just Eastern Food Hub Initiative, we have been talking to Washington Metropolitan Council of Governments, which I know a lot of us also are in on those talks. And through the Maryland Food Resiliency Council, we hope to kind of have some structures to just keep the communications open and collaborate. So are there any quick clarifying questions before I can introduce Dr. Ashton? Okay. Okay, so great. Hearing none, I shall move on to Weslynne Ashton. And we are so lucky to have Dr. Ashton here to help us understand food hubs writ large. Dr. Ashton is the Associate Professor of Environmental Management and Sustainability at the Illinois Institute of Technology Stewart School of Business. She also leads the National Food Hub Survey through the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. Sorry, yeah, making sure I got all that right. So thank you so much, Dr. Ashton.
Thanks, Lauren. And I believe I'm sharing my screen, so just confirm. Yep, okay, great. Well, that was a great introduction for me to learn about the things that y'all are doing. And I, thought it was very interesting that you talked about collaboration, right? And so cooperation and collaboration is an important theme that has come up in the work that we're doing. So we started this work with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, and my colleague Marlie Wilson, who is the Good Food Purchasing Program Manager at CIFPAC, sends her apologies for not being able to join us today. We've been talking about food hubs and cooperation for some time, and so it's interesting to see the parallels with the work that you guys are doing in Montgomery County. And I would say that, one of our main drivers for thinking about food hubs is how might they address food insecurity in Chicagoland, right? So we can think about the different types of drivers that affect food insecurity across the state, but particularly in the city of Chicago and Cook County, where we're based. Both Chicago and Cook County signed on in 2017 and 2018 to the Good Food Purchasing Program. And the GFPP tries to orient institutional purchasing with a move away from least cost to more a values-based procurement strategy. And so there are 5 core values in the GFPP: improving nutritional quality, environmental sustainability, creating a valued workforce, developing local economies, and addressing animal welfare issues. The Food Hub feasibility study that CIFPAC commissioned and that we are working with them on was really thinking about how can we use the GFPP as a leverage and using institutional purchasing to support the needs of local producers by connecting them to opportunities that are created by the GFPP. But in addition to this, we were also very interested in how can we serve the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, both producers and eaters within the system, that there's a strong focus on racial equity. We're looking at cooperative ownership models and building on existing initiatives. As we started this work, really as the pandemic started, so in early 2020, we realized that there are many organizations in Chicagoland that don't call themselves food hubs, but are actually operating just like them. They're doing many of the same functions. The first piece of our work, which was led by one of my former students, Jay Qureshi, looked at analyzing the data in the USDA Food Hub directory to understand what were some common characteristics, different factors. So we looked at the legal structures, found that about half of the food hubs in that directory are organized as for-profits, a third are nonprofits, and 13% are organized as cooperatives. And so that's either producer-led cooperatives, consumer-led cooperatives, hybrids that have a mix of stakeholders, and then there are a few others. The vast majority of the food hubs are organized as hybrids, right? So almost 70% serve both institutional or wholesale customers as well as retail or end consumers. Jay was able to pull information from Merchant Intellect to look at the finances, the revenues, and we found that the median annual revenue for food hubs in 2018 is about $225,000. But there's a great range of diversity, so many that are well below this figure, and particularly those that are organized as nonprofits. And some of the larger for-profits have annual sales, upwards of $100 million. We looked at just the different types of services. And so I think this is stuff that you all know, right? So distribution, aggregation, storage are kind of the key operational services. But then many food hubs offer other support services, including marketing, branding, transportation, and support with business management, which I think is, some of the points that Lorraine mentioned. So we see that there are really two main approaches and a number of hybrids in between. So the first is really focused more on selling to institutional and wholesale buyers. So we need larger facilities, a larger physical infrastructure, and there's a greater focus on tangible services such as aggregation and distribution. The second approach, which I would say is kind of the more grassroots approach, tends to be really focused on working with smaller farmers, helping them with support services, so marketing, brokering, consulting, and they mainly serve households as well as small institutions such as restaurants and retail. In our work, we wanted to understand kind of what is the potential here in Chicagoland. And so we conducted 3 pieces of work, kind of looking at what's the current state of the foodscape with respect to producers. We conducted an online survey in the beginning of 2021, looking at farmers within a 300-mile radius of Chicago to understand what they're producing, what they found were some of the key barriers to selling to institutions. We found that most sold directly to consumer, and most were offering specialty crops, fewer in animal production and commodities, and only 14% were currently selling to institutions. We asked why they weren't the majority, and scale, not having sufficient volume or the capacity to enter into contracts with institutions were some of the top reasons. But we also have the infrastructure, all right? So a lack of shared facilities and food hubs, and low connections, low connectivity with the institutions. And so this research has shaped some of the activities that we're now doing that's addressing, trying to build the connections between local producers and institutions. And so we've now instituted a biannual mixer that is hosted by the Chicago Food Policy Action Council to bring local producers and institutional buyers together. And that includes both the city institutions as well as the food service companies, such as Aramark, that are actually supplying them so that we can build relationships between these folks. We also looked at the point of view of aggregators. Some of the key things that they mentioned were looking at how do they attain profitability and scale, that was the largest pressure point for them. And that because most buyers and institutional buyers focus on lowest price, there was huge pressure on them to meet that price point, and also to diversify the services that they offer in order to meet their profitability goals. So one of our interviewees mentioned, really focusing on value-added production, right? So the kitchen services, the meal preparation, as being critical to attain profitability. Another mentions diversification of the revenue streams. So both in terms of what they supply and who they supply to is important for maintaining profitability. I think one of the things that you guys found, like building up the local resources, the capacity within the producer community is really something that is necessary. With the GFPP, we were able to pull some purchasing information from our city and county institutions. And so we have just this very rough estimation based on their spending that of what the top crops are that they currently purchase. And so these includes potatoes, plums, apples, etc. But by spend, we found that a little less than half of what they're spending is on animal products and value-added products, but specialty crops is a very small percentage of their total spend. We try to categorize what are the items that they are purchasing. So about 16% is raw, but almost a half of what they're purchasing is cooked, prepared meals, and that is in part shaped by constraints on the institutional side, that they might not have kitchen facilities to prepare food themselves or the staff to do that, and so they really need to have food that's coming in that's already prepared in order to serve their meal recipients. So we find that it's very hard for small producers to sell directly to institutions because of the volume, the lack of certifications, the lack of resources and connections. And so we've been thinking about, okay, what are some different models that build on things that are happening here in the city and the county that we can leverage. But this has to be based on the interviews, flexible in scale, have community support, and be centered on the needs of BIPOC communities. So I think a starting point for us is thinking about different goals, right? So we do see that because there are some organizations that are already operating as food hubs, that being clear on what you want to achieve, whether it's profitability, whether it is supporting equity, whether it's reducing food waste, would indicate a different set of structures, a different set of activities that you ought to prioritize. We are exploring a couple of different models, and we've kind of ranged this from a more centralized to a more decentralized approach. And at the bottom here are a couple examples. So the New York City Food Hub is an example of a large food hub that has many services all under one roof. In development right now in Chicago, we have the Dream Food Hub, which is multiple locations offering multiple services, right? So there's a kitchen facility, there's a food hall, there's a distributor services, but it's one organization that is running all of these activities and coordinating these different businesses. So they're established as different businesses with one coordination mechanism. And one of the things that we're seeing here is that we have these micro food hubs. So Iman, which is the inner city Muslim Action Network, has established some corner stores where they're bringing in fresh food from local farms and providing those to communities. There's an Austin Community Food Co-op that's in development. And so there are actually like several retail cooperatives, consumer-owned cooperatives that are in development. And so we are thinking about how can we link these activities together rather than having a single food hub. As we kind of prepare and finalize our food hub feasibility study, we're encouraging different models to think about what are the different costs, looking at facilities, equipment, labor certifications, and planning, as well as different revenue structures that they're going to need in order to be profitable or at least have a sustaining source of revenue. So in thinking about revenue streams, we encourage folks to think about the diversity of revenue streams, and especially for startup costs, like if we are going to be a more grassroots, decentralized models, what are ways that we can offset some of the high startup costs, such as facilities and using shared equipment, renting space, and sharing vehicles, using vehicles that might be owned by others within the network. So really this sort of cooperative vision is something that I feel like we really need to employ here in Chicagoland. So with that, I will pause and thanks for your attention and ask you if there are any questions. I think I'm good on time. Let me pull up the chat here.
Yeah, Weslynne, I was going to say there's a question in the chat that says, how are you distinguishing specialty crops from value added? Is the former category non-processed?
Yes. So specialty crops are the raw materials. The value added are any type of processing. And so one of the things that we tried to do in our analysis of what the institutions are purchasing is look at the level of preparation that was required. So I'll just jump back to this. So the raw products versus things that were just cut and mixed, right? So we might think about a salad. The third category were things that need to be frozen or preserved in some way before being sold. And the fourth category, so categories 2 to 4, we would think of as the value added. And, like we found that a large portion of what they're purchasing, is in this final kind of most prepared category.
I think Deborah has her hand up. Go ahead, Deborah. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hi, Weslynne. My question is really about when I look at the list of the items, and as a retired USDA AMS person, I look and I say, oh, I wonder what the level of competition is from subsidized food from USDA for school systems when I look at this list. Mm-hmm. And so I think I just wondered sort of how that factored into your analysis as well, where there might be a national buy for something like the ground chicken. I think that really drew my attention. I don't see a local producers probably competing for that bid, especially given where school budgets are. But certainly baby carrots or processed carrots might be a really good opportunity. So I didn't know if you could reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question, and I'll add the caveat in here that this is based on spending and not on volume, right? And that's just kind of how the data came in. But yeah, there are large contracts that local producers are not able to access. I think one of the challenges that we've had in analyzing the institutional purchase data is that it's been hard to acquire. Each institution has data organized in its own way, and we're now finding that these different institutions, so either within the city, within the county, have their contracts organized differently. So, for example, the Chicago public school system, their contract is a lease cost, whereas the Chicago Park District has some flexibility in how they buy, and because they're buying a much smaller volume, they have more flexibility in sourcing from local producers. One of the things that we are doing kind of the next phase of this work is trying to do some product discovery and trying to understand what products that are currently being developed locally could act as substitutes. And so there's some negotiation, give and take happening from between supply side and demand side, because what we're finding in some of the conversations is that the small producers are like, yeah, it's going to be so hard for us to try to scale up and meet some of these needs. And so can the institutions meet us halfway? Like, what are things that might be reasonable substitutes for things that they're currently purchasing? And so that's kind of the next phase of the work that we're embarking on.
So can I ask a very quick follow-up, just because you're at IAT, and so I would imagine you have people that are working on food technology. Mm-hmm. And so when you talked about prototyping, so immediately my head goes to, oh, you actually have the capacity within your institution to probably work in an interdisciplinary space to come up with ideas of good substitutes. And I think that if that's happening, I think that's an incredible value add in this work, because that's unusual.
Yeah, no, that's great. So like we've been exploring. We haven't yet, but I'm going to pick that up from you and say that should be something that we develop on moving forward.
Thank you so much.
All right. So I know there's a couple questions in the chat. So I see a question from Lindsay regarding the success or the impact of the biannual mixers. So let's see, what year is this? We've had two so far. So there was a December 2021 and a June of 2022. And so I'd say that, like we're still in the early stages. One of the benefits that I see coming out of the mixes, and we actually have an evaluation team that is preparing an annual report with kind of the actual impact. But I would say from my perspective, one of the things that I've seen is some small producers actually say, oh yeah, maybe I can. So it's kind of opening up possibilities for these small producers to think about their planning for the next season, right? And you guys know about contracts and kind of like the long lead time. And so, so if we're having a meeting in December, it's hard to say, institute a new contract by next summer, but the wheels are turning, and I'm seeing some small farmers begin planning and thinking about, okay, how can I partner with or supply to some of these city or county institutions? And on the other side, it's kind of opening up the minds, creating the awareness amongst the institutions about what's available locally. So I wouldn't say that, like we've seen some contracts implemented as yet, but I feel that the awareness has been building. And so I think I'd expect to see some contracts coming on within the next year. So I think, should we go to Jill, Lorraine, and then I'll read the next question in the chat.
Yeah, that works.
Thank you. I produce chocolate, different flavors of chocolate, and I see that cookies is on your list. And since contracts have to have a lead time, I assume that a contract might come out, 6 months in advance of an event or whatever. Do the people who do the cookies, for example, have to have the same flavors on your shelves the whole time? And if so, what about the expiration date of them? How does that all work with things that are perishable? Do they remain on the shelf the whole time, or does the contract come in and then they're delivered to the food hub and the food hub takes them to the institution?
So currently, the institutions are serviced by large food service providers, and so one of the things we've been trying to do is to map out where those second and third order suppliers are that are servicing the food service providers that then supply to the institutions. I think that my understanding is that with the contracts are renewed not on an annual basis, but on like a 2-3 year cycle, and so we have to catch them. The food service providers are the ones who kind of maintain the big contract with the institutions, but then those food service providers contract with their own suppliers, and so there's the potential for the smaller suppliers to come in at different points with the large food service provider. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to help those food service providers see and work more with the local producers. The idea for the food hub is that these food hubs might provide an alternative to the current food service providers, or might work with the food service providers to do some of that more local sourcing and coordination in order to provide some diversity, right? Like one of the things that's coming up is adjusting menus to be more culturally relevant to the different ethnic communities that we have across the region. And so that presents another opportunity for our local producers to connect with and access opportunities for to serve the institutions.
So if I understand you correctly, and I may not, it sounds like if you're a small producer of a perishable item, the food hub may have you on a list somewhere where if some institution reaches out to the food hub, the producer of a perishable item doesn't have to always have the food on the shelves per se at the food hub, but the food hub reaches out to the producer and says, hey, we need 1,000 pieces of blah blah, we need 1,000 cookies of blah blah blah, and so then they're fresh. Is that correct?
Yes. So I'd say that it's hardly the case that there's long-term storage going on the food hub. That since we are dealing more with perishable items, that kind of more dynamic nature. And so this is why a network approach and this more sort of cooperative approach, so understanding kind of who are all of the producers within the local region that might be able to supply different products that they would have calls out, right? And I don't want to make it sound like it's today for next week, but there are contracts that would be put in place and planning that would happen in coordination with the local producers, but it's more dynamic than the sort of longer term contracts that the food service providers have with the institutions.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Ashton. I would like to also just read one more question before we transition to Adam Pendleton. Let's see. Oh, it just disappeared. Okay, great. Let's see. Heather Breskin says, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more to the initial origins of these projects, infrastructure investments. Is there better success when they're initiated by private sector versus government? And if government, what role do they play? Funder, operator, owner, build out manager, etc. Is there a customary branch agency that normally leads?
I think there's a variety. And we have not looked at whether a particular originator tends to be more successful. I think what we're seeing is there are a variety of goals, and if the goal is profitability, there are private initiated food hubs who are very successful and have a large scale, but their goal is profitability, right? If your goal is social equity and ensuring that low income folks in your community have enough to eat and have culturally relevant, appropriate food to eat, then profitability is not the key factor. And so being organized as a nonprofit, could be a for-profit or a nonprofit, but grants might be needed to support that. And so I think our metrics of success need to be different for different types of food hubs, depending on what the goals are established and what's deemed important in the communities that they're serving. So I think it's a hard question. So currently, like with the kind of food hubs that food hub like entities that we have in operation in Chicago, there's a mix, right? So there are some that are organized as for-profit, some are nonprofit, and they have different goals, and there's variable success, variable sources of funding depending on what those goals are and who they're meant to serve.
Thank
So I'm sorry,
you.
Heather, that was like a very it depends answer.
No, much appreciated. That's helpful to think about the goals of and the metrics for success as driving the origination. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashton. And I know probably many of us have way more questions for Dr. Ashton. If you would like to put them in the chat, and hopefully she might stay on for a few more minutes. And then we have a general Q&A if we have time at the end, which hopefully we will. But we are in for a real treat because as you all may have gathered, working in an actual food hub is an extremely, from what I can gather, it's an extremely busy job. And today, Adam Pendleton, who is the Assistant General Manager for Appalachian Sustainable Development's Appalachian Harvest Hub down in Duffield, Virginia, has taken time out of his schedule to tell us about the daily operations in their food hub. When I was down in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech, I was able to tour this facility and was just really impressed with how they make it all work. And we're going to go ahead and get a few slides going for Adam, and he's going to tell us how Appalachian Harvest Hub works. Thank you, Adam.
Hey, thanks for having me. I had talked to Maureen earlier and told her I wish I would have been a little more prepared for this, but as you can probably guess, it's a crazy time to be working in a facility like this with everybody trying to get everything out of the fields here before frost hits down their way, things like that. But yeah, just to give a little background on how Appalachian Harvest was started. Basically, in our area, and I'm not sure if this holds true in other areas, but there was a tobacco buyout. So a lot of the tobacco crop, it kind of went away for growers and left a lot of our farmers with several acres of plowable land that, they just didn't want to throw into hay crops. So I guess some of them got together there and they decided, to maybe give it a shot at the produce. And I guess there was some help initially with the startup from the Tobacco Commission on getting that funding going. It started prior to food safety, it started in a barn in Stickleyville, which is about 15 minutes from our current facility here at Duffield. They started solely as organic, and they sold only organic product for probably the first maybe 6 or 7 years up until about 2008. 2009. And the problem they realized was they were sending a lot of tractor and trailers and box trucks out with 1, 2, maybe 3 pallets of product on it, which if you all dealt with logistics any, it's not profitable. So then they brought on conventional growers in the early parts of 2000 there to kind of fill those trucks and help them go on down the road, which is transitioned to our current operation. We're probably, I'm going to say, I haven't ran numbers this year, but I would say we're probably 92 to 95% conventional. So organic's a very small portion of what we do at this time. And it seems like the picture you see here was food boxes that we done quite a few of during COVID. It seemed like during COVID, we've seen a really large shift market-wise. People were just more concerned with where the food was coming from and not so much about if it was local or not at that point. So, what we've seen since, I guess, about 19, it seems like the trend is more local rather than organic at this point. And, organics, it still moves, but used to you couldn't have enough of any organic product. And that's not the case that we see with our buyers at this point anyways. So a little more onto the grower portion of it. That's a brief history of how Appalachian Harvest was started. Our model is, our typical operation is we'll take 20% of the sales, whatever the price is that product sells at. And it's been that way since it started, to the best of my knowledge. They ran into some issues with it early on, where one market was paying, let's say, $15 for yellow squash, and another market may be paying $8. Well, they started having growers say, well, I don't want to sell mine to, Bob over here that's only paying $8. I only want to sell it to the $15. So they created a pricing model that basically takes a weighted average from Sunday to Saturday on our sales, to where it's everybody receives the same regardless of which market it goes to. So it's basically a median average deducted from then less the 20%, which pays for freight. We offer cooling, a packaging line. Actually, we have 2 packaging lines at this point that's available to the growers 24/7. We've got a door code on the building so they can kind of come and go and use that as they please. So when they moved to the new facility here in about 2008, they actually offered a grading line that was manned by staff. And they ran into quite a few issues with that. They had growers that felt like their product should have packed out better than it did, and they would get mad about that. And then if you had a rejection, it kind of fell back on the facility. Because we was essentially the ones that was overseeing that packaging. So that was kind of, it was hard to make everybody happy, basically. So they, I guess in about 2010, they done away with staffing that packaging line. And we went to offering the facilities for stuff to be packaged, but we didn't offer the service anymore. And that was prior to my time here, but I think it was probably a smart move just from what I've heard about it. It leaves a lot of room for error that falls back on Appalachian Harvest as a company. So some of the services that we offer to growers that you can see here in the background, you see a lot of boxes stacked up here in this picture. A lot of our growers, as I seen there in the 4P slide, are fairly small, honestly. About a half acre is the smallest we're currently working with. Let's say half of our growers is less than 10 acres probably. And that being said, it's a pretty big investment for them to go out and buy a couple pallets of boxes up front. You're probably talking, an additional $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. So what Appalachian Harvest does on that is we'll purchase the boxes. They're here, and if they want to come in and they need 5 boxes or 500 boxes, those are the growers. And rather than having to write us a check for those are then deducted out of their grower sales check for that week. Just had something flash up that my internet's unstable. Can y'all still hear me? Okay. So yeah, that'll be weekly, and it takes off that initial investment as far as the startup cost goes for growers. Again, we offer 2 different coolers with a couple different temperature zones for the cold storage. So the one you see here in the bottom picture in the right-hand corner, it's about 34 to 36. So we'll store broccoli, cabbage, kale. We do a lot of kale in the spring with some organic growers, actually. Who are you currently doing that with? Turnips, which is kind of about a thing of the past for us, but broccoli and cabbage is the main ones that we do year round in that cooler. And then just to the left of that one, we have a cooler that's probably about 2 or 3 times that size. That it's actually a man-built cooler rather than the panels like you see in that picture. That would store basically everything else: tomatoes, squash, peppers, cucumbers, which is our main crops for what our growers here in this area is doing. Pretty much we have a couple of months with the cold crops, and then the heat pretty much knocks us out on that. So the summer crops and then winter squash and pumpkins is our main seasonality here. The grading lines I was speaking of, you can see here in this picture in the center there. So we will work with growers when they come in on, on how we need it graded for our specs, for our buyers, quality control, etc. We try not to spend a lot of time once they're trained over there. We kind of leave that up to them because of the issues I mentioned in the past. But if we have somebody that's not real busy, we may pitch a hand in on making boxes or something of that nature. Another big service we offer actually for air growers, and we have a lot of growers outside of their internal network here that'll attend those trainings, is the GAP trainings. We usually put on about 3 to 4 of those a year across the state of Virginia. Usually a couple hundred people attend those each year. And then we have helped growers outside of the network on it, but typically it's air growers that we'll do this with. We went as far as going onto their farm, working with them on setting up their manual, even been there when the auditor comes out for that first initial inspection to kind of just offer any support, if a question was to arise. And that, I don't know where your all's food hub's potentially going if you're looking at GAP or not, but we've had a lot of growers that probably wouldn't have done it if we didn't offer that type of support. When GAP first came down the pike, there was a lot of them that was ready to throw in the towel and quit, but they stuck it out and we got through it. Still evolving. We're trying to step all of our growers up to harmonize GAP now. We're working on transitioning their facility to Primus. So it's one of those things that's kind of ever evolving and a hoop you have to jump through to access some of the large markets. We'll see if I'm missing anything. Trying to keep it to the 10 minutes here. Of course, we've got 2 tractor and trailers, a box truck that we shuttle all the product up and down the East Coast with, moving that to the facilities. We work with about 2 or 3. One's a farmer's market, one is a food bank, and then just a small aggregation building across West Virginia, a little further north of Virginia than we are in Kentucky to aggregate products. So we pick up there a couple times a week to help growers that's a little further away get that product back to the facility here. And then we also, we are a nonprofit. We also raise funds in the off season to buy seconds from our growers that will in turn pay them 40 cents per pound to donate those to the food banks here locally. So we're pretty adamant on that. It's not a huge amount, but we usually try to donate maybe $30,000 worth a year or something, just whatever we can come up with. And that seems to go a long way whenever you're in a rural area like we are. Let's see. I believe that's pretty much the gist of what we've got going here, in a nutshell, at least.
Thank you so much, Adam. Can I also just ask you something we talked about staffing? about how difficult it is to find folks.
Yeah.
To fill
Yeah.
the jobs.
So yeah, staffing it's always been a challenge. It's a line of work that it's kind of hard to find anybody with any experience in, especially in this area. Maybe some more opportunities for people that's familiar with vegetable production up in, Maryland or Pennsylvania, maybe up that way. But honestly, it's pretty much non-existent here. And what we've found, we went through 3 or 4 different people working the facility since I moved on from that position. And I think the main things we've found is you have to have somebody that cares. You can train them about the produce, you can train them about the specs, all that's trainable, but you can't train somebody to care if the truck's loaded right and if the cooler count's right and that the product's, going to pass into spec and, keeping the facility organized and clean and things like that. That's the things you can't train. Everything else, you can work with not knowing something, but if they don't care, then it's just not going to work out from my experience.
Thank you so much. Well, are there any other questions for Adam? And my apologies, Esther, I can't see the chat. Have there been any questions that emerged in the chat for Adam?
I currently do not see any questions yet. I'm sure there will be. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand in the reactions in the sidebar and we can, okay, I see Michelle. You can go ahead and unmute.
Hey, Adam, thanks so much. This is so interesting. And thanks so much for taking the time to join us. I know you're really busy. I guess my question is about operation and like the sustainability of your operation from like a cost perspective. Have you found that it's easier to, like, are there plans to continue growing? Do you feel like you're the right size? Just anything you can share about, like, I know that a lot of these facilities have been created and some of them have not been able to be sustained. So like, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging, especially only having about a 4-month local season. The rest of the year, we've got a couple markets that we try to keep going year round with partners that have some farms up and down the East Coast, which helps. But at the same time, when you add that much expense on trucking, it's hard to make much of a percentage on that. So really, I say that to say basically that time of year we're doing it to hold the markets for local farmers, not so much to make money. We did run a analysis, a pretty extensive one, I guess 2 years ago, and I believe we determined that break even was right around 4 million. It was at like 3.1 or 3.2 last year. So we're getting there, but I say that and then fuel costs doubled. So we haven't looked at it this year, but I imagine that's increased by several $100,000 just due to the increase in fuel.
So I guess as a follow-up question, how do you all make up that gap? And
yeah, mostly grant funding, honestly. We have some other programs that pull in a little income that's not necessarily related to the food hub. We've got an herb hub. We've got groundworks, which is mainly reintroducing people into the workforce that's had just different challenges that they're working on overcoming. And they have a few projects that pulls in a little bit of income, but it's mainly grant funding. We've had a couple. We had, let's see, 2, I believe, pretty good ARC grants to kind of push to extend our work into the other states there. And then all the gap training, that's done through VAX funding. So that's been a big help. That's one we've done for several years. And then just, I guess, like every other nonprofit, whatever little pot of money we can find here and there along the way. So hopefully we can get through. We don't have to rely on that, but at this time, that's still playing a role in our profit. Well, I guess not profitability, but staying, just kind of surviving.
as a person in the nonprofit sector, I understand. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. And I see Ivy Baker, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Ivy.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Adam, thanks for the presentation. Found it really interesting and insightful. I had a question about, you mentioned kind of the issues I think that the buyers had with pricing of certain produce. Just could you share a little bit more insight about how you guys found a solution around those price points when it could have been kind of more competitive and people could price each other out instead of having a system where everyone can work together to find good prices on these produce?
Yeah. Yeah. So to elaborate on that a little bit, we needed all of our buyers to be able to even think about making this sustainable. Ones that paid $10 are the ones that paid 20. It was the grower end of it that was kind of, I mean, nobody wants to take less for their product than they have to. So the model we was able to put in place to accommodate the growers and still fill all those markets was an average pricing. So let's say I sold 100 yellow squash at $10 and you sold 100 at 20. We would both receive 15 less than 20%. So basically it's just, real simple math, just a median average on that pricing. So where, regardless of where your produce went and what it paid, you was going to receive the same as the next farmer did for it. But I guess it allows us to kind of send some product to a buyer that doesn't pay great and make it up with some of our buyers that, is willing to pay a little more and understands that it's local and they're supporting 30 farmers on one PO, the whole deal there. So that's kind of the way we've worked around that. Guess we've been doing that for probably 10 or 12 years now, and it seems to work out pretty well. The biggest issue we found with it is none of the softwares that kind of are made around food hubs and legit shipping and receiving are made to accommodate that kind of pricing structure. So it's been pretty challenging to try to work with the different software vendors to create a process that kind of, puts all that together.
Okay, it's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Yep.
That's the perfect segue into the next question, because I know when we were at 4P Foods, Tom said, Adam, that they were putting together some sort of new software. So you might want to talk to them. We have a question, I think one more question from the chat from Lindsay Smith, who says, could you talk a little bit more about the geographic distribution of Appalachian Harvest products on the East Coast? And are you part of the Eastern Food Hub Collaborative? And if so, how do you participate and how does the participation work?
So we are part of the Eastern Food Hub Collaborative, but unfortunately, we've not been able to do any transactions within the collaborative there. I think, as you said there, I've seen the 300 miles. It's challenging. You're in produce, you're selling a very low value commodity, and then you add outrageous freight onto it right now, and the market just can't sustain the pricing of that, basically. As far as the area we're covering currently, we have growers as far as Bath County, Kentucky. Got a couple in London and one right around Berea. Then we work with growers up in the Hillsville, Virginia area, off the backside of the mountain there in North Carolina. And then, of course, here locally in Duffield, Virginia, where the food hub's located at. We've got a couple points that's aggregated to. It works out that our trucking routes just happen to be coming by those locations and can pick that up without adding a lot of additional cost. And then as far as our markets, how far we're traveling out on those is we go as far up as, I guess at this point, we're going as far as Richmond, Virginia. And then we go as far down as towards Atlanta, Georgia. So all of our routes currently lay along that. We did come up to, it's not a consistent route, but we've actually came up as far as Maryland on our sales routes before. But right now, we really haven't been running that one very often. And occasionally we'll go as far out as Louisville, Kentucky, but again, that one's kind of hit or miss.
Thank you so much. This has been really great, Adam. Again, thank you so much for taking some time out of your extremely busy day in an extremely busy season. Adam also shared with me that his primary crop that he farms is pumpkins, and as we all know, is pumpkin season. And so just really appreciate your time. And if anyone has any more questions for Adam, if he is able to stay on a little bit longer, we just drop them in the chat. But we also have a few questions for you all, knowing that we have just another 15 minutes or so on the call here. We'd really like to gather feedback from you to sort of continue to develop our planning effort. And it was with a slight bit of horror that I discovered we had a poll, but it disappeared. Oops. And so I would like to just really quickly show a slide, and if you all wouldn't mind answering a question we have that was going to be a poll that is now a question to put in the chat. If you all wouldn't mind, please reading through these elements. And as we've heard about food hubs, we see that there's all these different services that are offered, all these different elements that makes a food hub, but each one is different. As I've learned, I've heard several people say, if you've seen one food hub, you've seen one food hub. They're all different. In Montgomery County, we have all these different elements that may or may not be part of the final effort. And we'd like to hear what you all think are the most important ones. So basically, if you all pick the top 3 and place it in the chat, and we can go ahead and just see what you all might like. So let's just take one moment to think about that. So great, and I think I'm going to leave it to Massa, if you wouldn't mind, since I actually can't see the chat right now, to tell us when we're done thinking about this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll give it people are starting to respond, so we'll give it another minute, and I can let you know, Maureen.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And obviously, since this is in the chat, any commentary is also extremely welcome on any of these elements, or the of course the other at the end.
Just one theme that's emerging. Everybody that's responded has said aggregate. A lot of people saying distribution also. I've seen services to farmers a couple times also. Shared kitchen space. It's come up a few times.
Great. And now, for those of you who have already answered the question in the chat, we also had a few questions we would have just wanted to ask directly. And if you would like to go ahead and place your answer in the chat, that'd be great. And it just sort of goes along with, are there any existing facilities out there that we haven't mentioned or you think we might not know about yet that we would need to engage for the Food Infrastructure Opportunity Series? If you could just place that in the chat, we'd love to hear it. Okay, and then our final question before we move on to our general closing Q&A about this process, where we can just open it up for a few pressing questions, is, and perhaps you can continue to answer this while we're doing our Q&A, is what would you like to learn more about here? So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and we can open it up for general Q&A if that's all right with everybody. And I see, Ivy, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? Okay, I'm thinking that Ivy may have left his hand up from before. That's okay. So does anybody have any general thoughts, comments, questions about the Food Infrastructure Opportunities Initiative? Feel free to drop it in the chat if you don't want to unmute, but also feel free to just unmute and ask.
Maureen, I see a comment from Susan Eisendrath that I can read out in the chat. She said, as far as I know, our county doesn't have an analysis baseline of what an amount of food currently produced, et cetera, markets, et cetera, similar to what Dr. Ashton presented. And that seems to be the first thing that needs to be done to determine the priorities and other aspects of how we could design and implement a food hub and also finance it.
Can I just follow up on that? And that is, it's sort of maybe a part two or connected to Heather Bruskin's question related to, so who would be responsible for that? Is it the Food Council? Is it county government? Would it be a private entity? Would it be UMD? We seem to be, I mean, this was a great presentation. All of the presenters were fabulous. And I think we have a good list, but we seem to be discussing sort of similar things over and over again. And we're also discussing these kind of things in the environmental impact working group in the sector that is talking about increasing local food production. So I would really like to see if there's some kind of way that we could have a more commitment from the government and other institutions.
Susan, all these are very important questions. I can speak to your first question just a touch about the estimation of food production capacity in the county. Just that it's an ongoing question that keeps coming up in multiple spaces that we don't have a good estimate. We have our What Our Region Wears report, that's the regional report. We do have the Montgomery County Ag Census data, but we definitely need to continue this conversation. And in the Food Council, we've been talking about how we can help facilitate that. I see that I think Benjamin Kraft just unmuted. Did you have a question?
Well, I was sorry, you can't really see me. My camera's all twisted. I don't know so much of a question or like just a thought maybe for further discussion, but it seems that for something like this, the way that I guess I think we are all envisioning it here in Montgomery County, what an actual food hub would look like would help encourage local like regenerative farming and local local distribution of local foods around. And it seems to me that at least initially there's really no the chances of profitability are very low in the early years of doing something like this. And I hear these stories about looking for grant funding. It just seems to like really set something like this up for success. Identifying a reliable, constant stream of funding, like possibly the council dedicates funding to something like this in the before it would even get started, would be really helpful, and would just, obviously everything in every venture that anyone has can benefit from constant predictable funding, but it just seems to me like it would be useful not only for making the something like a food hub like this successful, but also for being able to really promote the types of growing and types of food that I think we all want. So both just profitable and in kind of the public interest to go along with like what I assume are the Food Council and growers in Montgomery County's general values, because it's just, I think frankly not going to, we're going to have to subsidize that kind of growing and that kind of food. So it could be, I don't know how to exactly do that, but I think there's going to be definitely a political component of this to get that funding.
Right. And by the way, I can quote Chris, the one who runs Dreaming Out Loud. He said, our entire food system is subsidized. So if any effort is competitive, it also has to tap into some of that funding.
Yeah, it has to be competitive with the conventional parts of the food system.
Great point. Other questions? Well, okay, I just want to also mention that Lori Savage asked about if there was a list of commercial kitchen space in the county or someone had put it together. Luckily, the Montgomery County Economic Development Commission recently did compile a list of shared kitchen space. And I think I'm going to ask them if it's okay to share out, but we can probably put that in with our resources for this initiative. So yeah, and it basically was a list of what they called underutilized kitchen space that was available. Great, and I see that Lindsay Smith just sent a new DC resource of possible interest, the Sustainable Supply Chain Working Group. The Food Council has released a values-based procurement buyer's guide. Great, she shared the link, that's great. Well, all right. Unless there are other questions or comments, I'll go ahead and pass the baton back to Esther to go ahead and close our meeting.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my camera's off. My internet is a little unstable. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, no, thank you everyone. And thank you, Weslynne, for your wonderful presentation, and Adam. I know both of you are so busy. So thank you for taking the time and just sharing all your wonderful just research and experience with us. I think it was just helps make these conversations just super informative and thought-provoking for what we're trying to do. So just wanted to remind you all that to join us for part 2, that will be on October. Let me get the exact date for you all. October 18th will be our part 2, and we will be discussing the financing of those different models and just continuing the conversation. So make sure you join us for that. And we will send the reminders for that meeting as well. So you can put that on your calendar. But we also want to invite everyone to the upcoming food sites that we're going to be, the site visits, I'm sorry. And the next one we have coming up is La Cocina in VA. So we have 2 different dates for those, October 12th and October 24th. And we ask that you register for whatever date works best for you. Oh, I'm sorry, that link did not transfer over to the chat. So this is the link for October 12th. And then again, these links are in the email that was sent out earlier today. So you can go back if you don't get a chance to click on it right now. But yeah, would love for everyone to join us. And their storage space is limited. So as soon as the capacity is reached, we will cut that off. But thank you everyone for your time and your engagement. And thank you again to our presenters, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you so
Bye.
much,
Take care.
everybody.